Welcome back to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Carter Krishnaiyer. No Robert this week, as this is a an edition of the podcast requested by some of you, our Florida History Podcast listeners, which is about the founding and failure of New Smyrna in the Revolutionary era, American Revolutionary era, requested by some of you. We had glossed over this in our series on the Revolution that Robert and I did, and it's not talked about very much in the book we've written either. It is talked about somewhat. Now, I have written about it in my book, Florida and the British Prior to the American Revolution, which was self-published and you can find on Amazon. Actually, it was published via the Florida Squeeze, technically. So I'm just going to go through what my research for that book, which was separate from the book and the American Revolution series we've just completed, says. So, a new settlement south of St. Augustine was established in 1768. New Smyrna, which is now, of course, called New Smyrna Beach because we put beach on the end of everything in Florida, it seems like all these towns, was the brainchild and project of Andrew Turnbull, a successful Scottish physician, important he was Scottish, not English, friend and a physician and a friend of Governor Grant. Turnbull had resided in Smyrna, which was in the Ottoman Empire. He'd been a part of the British ministry's delegation to the Ottoman Empire. And so Smyrna, which is, of course, now Izmir, I believe, right, in Turkey, but was a Greek city. His wife was a daughter of a prominent Smyrna merchant, so hence the name Smyrna. The Greek name is not a coincidence. Turnbull, in partnership with Sir William Duncan, acquired 100,000 acres for what was proposed to be the largest colonial settlement in British North America. Turnbull recruited settlers from Minorca, Livorno, southern Italy, Corsica, and various points in the Ottoman Empire, including Greece. So you had a Greek Orthodox community. Eventually, he was able to coax 1,400 people to come to Florida, and with 100 slaves that were then acquired, the new town had about 1,500 people by 1770, so within 2 years. Turnbull's theory in recruiting what amounted to Spaniards, Italians, and Greeks to his colony was the feeling that people from the Mediterranean would cope better with Florida's climate than those from the British Isles. So that's an early admission that maybe Florida is more colonizable by people who weren't from the British Isles. Early admission just a couple of years into British rule of East Florida. Initially, the colony did quite well growing indigo, hemp, sugarcane, and producing rum. The semi-tropical climate allowed Turnbull to create a fusion of what worked well in the southern colonies of Georgia and South Carolina, which is the plantation economies based around indigo, tobacco, rice, and then what worked well in the British Caribbean, which was a plantation economy based on sugar, hemp, and production of rum. And after a few years of contraction and population loss for all of Florida, it felt like East Florida was finally growing again. Or so it seemed, and this colony was a big part of it. The British government had taken considerable interest in this New Smyrna colony. They helped finance it. They provided the helped finance the colony. They provided the money for transporting the laborers from the Mediterranean regions and developing an infrastructure at the port on Mosquito Inlet and transport networks that would get people to New Smyrna. Now, one of the other places he picked up workers and eventual residents was Minorca, which had been ceded to the British after the I believe Minorca was ceded after the Wars of Spanish Succession. I'm not sure. It was either the Wars of Spanish Succession or the 7 Years' War, right? I mean, these territories were often traded back and forth during all the wars of the 17th and 18th century. So it looked like things were going well at New Smyrna, but The work was difficult, and a number of workers ended up dying from disease. And as a result of the Native Americans making raids in the region, the Native Americans had yet to be pacified. At this point, they didn't have the common enemy that we talked about in this series with the Native Americans, and the British settlers were united against the American colonists, or the rebellious American colonists, not all American colonists, obviously. Now, New Smyrna did eventually produce some really good crops. Like I said, the indigo, the sugarcane, not the indigo, sorry, the hemp, the sugarcane, distilleries for rum. And, by 1772, 1773, it seems to be working well. But Turnbull personally had a bad relationship with his laborers, and there was poor working conditions. And Governor Tonin, who is obviously such a prominent figure in all of these conversations about the revolution, he didn't like Turnbull, and he was encouraging the laborers, many of whom marched northward to St. Augustine in 1776 and 1777. Now, at this point, the revolution has started. The American Revolution has started. St. Augustine has become a fortified town. It's become a repository for all of these people from who were part of the British military and who were ready to fight. We've talked about how militarized St. Augustine became after 1775. So these colonists, including the Minorcan community, decided to stay. And we did an episode on the Minorcans, I think in the first year we recorded this podcast back in 2019 or 2020. And quite frankly, that was before I began researching for these books. So may have to go back and add some details to that on the Minorcans specifically, and the Minorcan cuisine, which included their cheese pastries and the datil peppers and things like that worked its way into St. Augustine cuisine after 1777. So the colonists decided to stay in St. Augustine. They were given shelter by Tonin, although Tonin had a weary eye on the Minorcans. They were Catholics. They might be somewhat sympathetic towards the rebellion. There was no way of knowing for sure. Many were. And the Minorcan community in St. Augustine is the oldest, as we've talked about before, in the state of Florida, the oldest European community that has lived continuously. Obviously, there are Native Americans who may have lived longer than that in Florida, but we know that a lot of the initial native tribes were wiped out by disease and replaced by Creeks who moved into Florida. So tracing that timeline is not something I have an expertise in doing. And actually, let me correct myself again. I'm seeing in my own notes that indigo was produced in New Smyrna. It was not produced at quite the quality levels of the hemp and the sugar cane and the rum, but it was produced there. And so a combination of the difficult working conditions and diseases, right, insect-borne diseases, and the Native American raids led to the fall of this colony. So after these people moved to St. Augustine and didn't return, the colony just basically collapsed. And as we know, and we talk about in our book, Robert and I, the settlement of loyalists who fled from the Carolinas and Georgia to Florida, British loyalists, Tory loyalists, they fled into Florida, and St. Augustine was bursting at the seams, and others were settled along the St. John's River, a town called St. John's Bluff, which is roughly now where Jacksonville is, or actually really where Mayport is, right? So a little east of downtown Jacksonville. That's where a lot of the refugees, the settlers were put, or were settled. The refugees were settled, Tory refugees, coming from the other southern colonies that had fallen into the hands of the Patriots. So there was no attempt made after that to resettle New Smyrna. Now, years later, when Florida is part of the United States. That area on Mosquito Inlet, it's now Volusia County, obviously, was resettled. But it was not done in the time period when the British were in control of Florida. The colony was abandoned after 1777. So that's a quick talk about Andrew Turnbull and the New Smyrna colony. It's not very detailed, I know, but this was just responding to a request by multiple people saying, hey, you guys have done great. You guys have really enjoyed the series, but you missed this very crucial piece, which I concede is something I had covered in a previous book I wrote and connected it to the colonial period between 1763 and 1775, not necessarily to the American Revolution, but it is correct to say that the Menorcans and the other laborers who abandoned New Smyrna and moved to St. Augustine, that happened in 1777, after the American Revolution has begun, and they're incorporated into the British defenses of St. Augustine and the British town life in St. Augustine.